So how can I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Now, the main reason you believe that is basically because it's recorded in the gospel accounts, the stories of Jesus' life in the New Testament. Now, you might say, well, how can I trust that? That's just something someone wrote. Well, essentially what they are, they're testimonies. They're witness accounts designed to be given to you, like in court. You know, in a court, people don't actually see what happens. People testify to it, and you decide whether to believe that or not. So you ask, why do I believe these testimonies? Well, one of the things that gives a testimony credibility in court is when it contains elements which kind of work against itself. You can imagine if somebody's accused of murder and their alibi involves having to confess to having stolen something. So they don't want to say that they stole something, but actually that's what gives it credibility, because it includes elements they wouldn't want to be known. Well, the gospel accounts actually include a lot of these kind of elements which really work against itself. For instance, each of the accounts of the resurrection, all four gospels, the first witnesses are women. And they play this incredibly important role actually in all the gospel accounts. The women are the faithful ones, the ones who understand, the ones who have seen. But in the first century, women's testimonies didn't count for anything. They weren't even admissible in court. Why would you possibly include those? Why don't you skip over those and go straight to the male accounts? It'd be a far stronger argument. There's really only one reason you would include the women account like that and the women testimonies is if that's how it actually occurred. It's really the only reason to include them. Or else the leaders. You know, if people believe that these accounts were fabricated to help this, growing religious movement to give the leaders some sort of standing behind, behind what they would say, why are they depicted the way they are in the stories? When Joseph Stalin, became leader of Russia, he actually had himself painted into portraits of famous scenes with Lenin and written into histories to give him credibility as a leader. Look, I was there. Look how I was during the Russian Revolution. But in the gospel accounts, these early leaders are seen as generally faithless, often petty, not understanding what's going on. Even Peter is seen as denying Jesus, not once, but 3 times in just the most horrid fashion. Why would you ever include that? Or I think even Thomas's confession, when doubting Thomas sees Jesus, he says, after the post-resurrection, he puts his hands in his side and he says, my Lord and my God. He calls a man in front of him God. You got to understand, this is Jewish literature. This is to a Jewish audience. You'd never include a confession. I mean, Lord is maybe maybe okay, or my Messiah, but to call him God, this is one thing the Jews never did. You mean Romans or Greeks or other people groups could do that, but that's what set apart the Jews. God said, you can't believe in God, and there's only one God who made all things, and don't even make an image. Don't even make something that looks like him. This is actually your view of God is what sets you apart from all other people groups. Even as when the Romans and Greece were controlling Israel, they were a pain because they would never worship Caesar as God. This is the one people group who couldn't do that. You would not include that in this account unless that's what actually happened. That's the confession he made. And even if someone wants to argue that it became very, Roman and Greek at that time. It wasn't Jewish so much anymore. But then you would never include the crucifixion. Because we think of the cross it almost has an air of nobility today. People wear them around their necks. But at that time, that was a symbol of humiliation and degradation. That was the powerlessness and the strength of the Roman Empire. And you're going to show your God, your leader, the one you're worshiping and following, as being degraded and humiliated before the Romans in that way? You'd never show that. Even after he rose from the dead, he would keep the holes, the signs of that humiliation, degradation on his body. You'd never do that. Utter foolishness to the Greeks. So the account has incredible credibility. But someone may say, well, that's fine, I get it. The accounts have a lot of credibility as testimonies, but you understand, it describes someone rising from the dead. I have a problem with the content. I don't care about the text. Well, it's actually not that crazy to believe someone rose from the dead. Yeah, it's not something you see at all, and it seems wild, but we're actually surrounded by the wild if you think about it. If you think about the universe and all creation itself, it's unbelievable. I mean, if you were to tell me that you pick up this little tiny seed and say, oh, by the way, I'm going to put this in the ground, and sometime later there'll be a giant tree with fruit coming from it which you can eat, you'd think, are you crazy? That's insane. But we don't think it's insane just because it happens all the time. The same thing with somebody being born. It happens all the time. It's actually amazing, this little baby comes out who can do all these things and these bodies work the way they are, we're actually surrounded by the stunning and the amazement. It just doesn't stun us that much because it's normal. The resurrection is not that crazy to believe, it's just unusual. It's actually not that big of a deal to reanimate life. Life is more amazing to begin with. How a body ever came there than to reanimate this life. But the idea is that God said, I'm doing things which are unusual so that you can believe it. It's a sign. That's the very idea. This is the one person which God stepped into the world. If there were a lot of times people rose from the dead, then you wouldn't believe it. It's kind of a catch-22. God has to use things which are unseen and unusual, which never happen in any other fashion. All the miracles are like that. So there's actually incredible reason to believe it. It's not a crazy thing to believe. It's a very reasonable thing to believe those accounts. But what God's looking for us, of course, is not simply to think, oh, I think that happened. He actually wants our hearts. He wants something far more. But that's a subject for another video. Thanks.